Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. A lot of developments in favor of the Russians, especially in the eastern section of the front line, both across the Serbis River line and in the Serbiansky Forest area. The Russians also managed to advance within the area in between Kościanivka and Pokrovsk, as well as in the southern parts of the city, expanding the zone of control and enabling a supply line directly into their forces operating within the city. Russians advanced in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region. In turn, the Ukrainians are attempting some counterattacks in the Sumy region, where they are counterattacking the Russian positions within Unakivka. They're also attempting new offensive operations within the Kursk region, in the direction of Novye Put and Titkino yet again. They also started offensive operations in the direction of Bryansk. So far it is just small DRG groups attempting to enter into the Bryansk region. However, this footage here of the Australian Abrams tanks under training in Ukraine also features a new sign on the tank, which indicates a new offensive. This could be another offensive into the Kursk region, as we are seeing with these cross-border fighting, as well as the counterattacks in the Sumy direction to regain control over the border area, but it could also be in the Bryansk region as a new attempt following their attempts in the Belgorod and Kursk regions. The Ukrainian attacks across the border area in the Bryansk region were targeted at the settlement of Manev here along the border area, mainly through the forest patch areas. This is why it is a DRG operation, because it's simply Ukrainian soldiers trying to cross over from the forest patch areas. However, they were instantly detected across the border area, which shows the Russian manning of the borders has significantly increased compared to prior Ukrainian incursions. In the east, the Ukrainians are attempting to re-enter Titkino and Novye Put across the border area, but there is no results territorial changes yet. Similar with the context in the direction of Unakivka, it is unsure whether the Ukrainians managed to recapture some territory or not, as fighting continues in the area. In the eastern section of the front line, there are a lot of developments in favor of the Russians, especially around the Serbiansky Forest area, Liman, and the western parts of the Serbis River line in the direction of the supply lines of Liman. The Russians managed to advance here in the northern flank of Serechne, gaining a foothold within the northern parts of the settlement. This foothold, combined with the eastern advance, shows new offensive operations by the Russians towards the supply lines of the Ukrainians here in the Serechne and Centrihulova directions. Russians are attacking both Centrihulova from the east and Serechne from the north. The Russians also continued the offensive operation in the direction of Torske, gaining control over all of the fortified positions in the central and eastern parts of the town, leaving the Ukrainians in just a small portion of Torske, which means the town will likely fall under Russian control very soon. The Russians also crossed the river line into the town of Zarishne, storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the crossing. Russians are working their way into Zarishne, following their push through Kolodyazi. The Russians will likely push towards Semerenets, gain control of it, and enter Zarishne from the north. With operations to gain control over Torske, they can cross over the river line into Zarishne from the east as well. The Russians made two separate advances within the Serbiansky forest area. To the southeast, the Russians are expanding control in the southern direction, looking to gain control over the marsh area of the forest patch, north of Serbianka and the Siversk section of the front line, and south of the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. At the same time, the Russians made an additional crossing into the forest patch area from the north, looking to create an additional encirclement of Ukrainian forces operating within the forest area. We're seeing the Russians are working with full pressure on the Ukrainian forces to gain full control over the Serbiansky forest area, all up to the river line, to be able to push into the eastern flank of Liman, the settlements along the river line, and establishing full control over the Serbiansky forest area in its entirety and enter into Liman from the east. With all of these advances, it is clear that the Russians are only weeks away from the Battle of Liman beginning. The Russians looking to gain control over Torske and Serishne in the east, the Serbiansky forest area in the south, and the settlements supplying Liman from the northwest. This will lead to the Russians attacking Liman from the east and from the west. At the same time, the Russians will look to gain control over Kolodiasy and Stavki for a push towards the north. All of this in preparation for launching offensive operations towards Liman from 3 separate directions, leaving only the crossing across the Seversko-Donetsk river line from Sloviansk into Liman as the only supply line for the Ukrainian forces. Liman is extremely important for the defense of the northern flank of the Sloviansk-Koshentinivka line and Siversk. The Russians also have good supply connections to the city, as they have railway connection directly from the Russian side of the border all the way down towards Liman along the Uskil river line. To the south, the Russians continue offensive operations in the northern flank of Toretsk, gaining control over several fortified positions on the southern flank of Alexandro-Sheltine, gaining control over the positions along the railway area and into the southern flank of the town, combined a push with the direction of Bilaora to the east and the railway to the south through Delivka. Russians are developing offensive operations on the southeastern flank of Koshentinivka to gain control over the fortified positions and the settlements leading into the city. Russians also gain control over Rusin Yar. Fighting over the fortified positions north of the town continues. However, the town itself is now fully under Russian control. Russians also continue advances along the northern flank of Poltavka to gain control over the western road leading into Rusin Yar for a combined push from the west and the east. This allowed the Russians to gain full control over the settlement, and the fighting is now being pushed in the northern direction to secure the northern flank, which will allow them to redirect their forces to the east and to the west for fighting over Volodymyrivka and Stepanivka. The Russians also continue their offensive operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, gaining control over additional forest lines and fields to the northwest of Mayak, northeast of Nikonorivka, gaining full control over Nikonorivka as well. Fighting is now being directed towards Doreshne in the western flank, the railway station here along the railway, as well as Nove Shakhove in the east and south. The Russians are approaching the town from these 2 directions to gain control over an additional road of the Ukrainian supplying supplies from Truskivka all the way to Pokrovsk. This connection is now being severed with the fighting over Novoshakhove, which will allow the Russians to direct their forces towards the defensive line in the east and Dobropilye in the west, as well as Belitske and Rudinske along the highway itself. In the southern parts of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue offensive operations, gaining full control over Troyanda, allowing them to have several supply lines leading into the city, where their infantry are already operating in the western, central, and eastern parts of the city. The Russians now have stable supply lines leading into the city, the outskirts of it, but they still need to secure the initial parts of it. Russians are here completely bypassing the Shakhtarsky district and fighting over the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city, and moving on to cut off the highway connections in the western parts of the city, limiting the supplies leading into the Shakhtarsky district to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a strong defense of the district. With these developments, the Russians are slowly getting closer to the encirclement of the Ukrainian positions within Pokrovsk, Vinnytsia, and the surrounding fortified positions and settlements by connecting the northern and southern flanks of the city. The offensive operations taking place within Pokrovsk is mainly centered around the residential area, where the Russians are working on establishing supply lines into their forces operating within the city. The Russians have managed to gain control over Troyanda here in the southwestern parts, which allows them to flank the Shakhtarsky district from the west and establish supply lines into the city through the forest lines and forest patch area. With control over the southern parts of the forest patch area, the Ukrainians are pushed into the northern parts and the Shakhtarsky district overlooking the forest patch area, and their advances along the residential area in the southwestern parts of the city, the Russians are establishing additional supply lines into it. Russians may look to gain control over the railway area as well. With control over the flank, the Russians will be able to cut off the supply lines and flank the fortified positions from the rear and from their flank, allowing them to gain control over them, leading to additional supply lines leading into the city itself. This will strengthen the Russian positions and supply capabilities to their forces operating within the city, and the Russians may look to gain full control over the city by simply swarming into it, overtaking the positions, clearing building after building, storming it directly head on, and cutting off the supply lines, while avoiding the main defensive positions of the Ukrainians, such as the Shakhtarsky district and the industrial areas. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continue offensive operations towards the town of Gumushavacha. They are looking to gain control over it by pushing through the forest lines and fields here to the east of the town, getting closer and closer to it. Fighting takes place over the fortified positions to the northeast and south of the settlement. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the final town here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, as they gain control over the junction between the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and the Pokrovsk region, and fight over the defensive positions of the Ukrainians in the first and second defensive line in the Zaporizhia region. The Russians also continue offensive operations in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region, where they are bypassing the apartment complex area and moving into the western flank of it, looking to cut off the junction here, crossing the river line, as they continue offensive operations within Plevnil and the eastern flank as well, advancing along the forest lines and forest patches, looking to gain control over the southern bank of the river line south of Stepnohirsk, strengthening their positions in the western outskirts of the first line of defense of the Ukrainians within the Zaporizhia region. All across the front line, the Russians continue to attempt to gain full control over the 4 regions in the south and east of the country, except Kherson, where the main fighting takes place across the Dnieper River. This will make it more difficult for such offensive operations to take place. At the same time, we're not seeing any major offensives, and while this takes place, the developments take place, Trump is now to meet Putin face-to-face for the first time. Putin meets a US world leader in many years face-to-face. And we see that the topic of this is the peace deal in Ukraine, where Putin puts forward some conditions for an immediate ceasefire, as well as negotiations for a long peace. Some of these conditions are territorial. The leaked information suggests that Trump is willing to give Putin the remaining parts of the Donetsk region in exchange for some territory. He said there will be some territory swapping. This will likely be the Russian holdings within the Kharkiv and Sumy regions to be switched in exchange for the Ukrainian holdings in the Donetsk region, not the Zaporizhia and Kherson, simply the Donetsk region, as well as some other conditions which were not clarified. If this is the case, then this territorial swapping is not proper, because the Russians hold approximately 2,000 square kilometers of territory outside the 4 regions in the Kharkiv and Sumy, as well as Chernihiv and Mykolaiv regions. As for the Ukrainian holdings within the Donetsk region, it is approximately 5,500 to 6,000 square kilometers, which is 3 times as much as the Russian holdings, not to mention the multi-layered defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians within the Donetsk region. Therefore, it is something that Ukraine will definitely not agree to, and that is the case as Kiev rejects land giveaway. So based on this, we see that Trump and Putin are going to negotiate a peace deal which both can agree to, after which Trump will likely show this to Europe and Ukraine, hoping for their agreement and support for this peace deal. If the case happens that Putin and Trump negotiates a deal that they both agree to, and Ukraine then refuses, and they do not reach a deal because Ukraine refuses a deal that Trump and Putin has agreed to, then it is likely that Putin will get the green light from Trump to continue the war, and Trump can pull out from the negotiation process. He put a deadline. He said, this is when I'll be looking to put the peace deal in effect. If that isn't met, and he just continues being dragged out in this conflict that he keeps saying he doesn't want to be a part of, it won't be surprising that he abandons it completely. Therefore, we may see the Russians stepping up the offensive operations following this meeting, which takes place next Friday, so in less than 7 days. It's approximately 6 days. And the meeting will take place in Alaska, which is US ground, the first time Putin visits the United States since September 2015. So that is 10 years ago that Putin last visited the United States. If Putin and Trump agrees to something like this, even if they do not agree to anything and it simply returns to as it was, this is a major victory for Putin, because it is his first entry into a Western nation since the war began, and it is the United States, the most powerful one. But no more speculation on that. We'll wait until the meeting takes place and they announce the findings. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.